You wake up one morning and something feels different, as if a veil has been lifted from your eyes. The world appears the same, yet you sense it with newfound clarity. This isn't just another day in an endless series of days. This is the moment when your real life begins. Nietzsche once wrote, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." But what he didn't tell you is that finding your why requires first recognizing that most of what you've been living for was never truly yours to begin with. The ancient Vedic sages understood this paradox thousands of years before modern psychology. They called it Maya, the grand illusion that keeps us trapped in patterns of existence that never truly satisfy our deepest nature. It's not just philosophy, it's neuroscience. Your brain creates pathways of least resistance, comfortable grooves of habit and perception that filter reality before you ever consciously experience it. Have you ever wondered why time seems to accelerate as you age? Why childhood summers felt eternal while adult years blur together in retrospect? The Upanishads explain this phenomenon through the concept of samskara, impressions on consciousness that deepen with repetition. Modern cognitive science confirms this understanding. Novel experiences create stronger neural connections and more detailed memories. Routine existence passes through the mind, leaving barely a trace. You're not just living less as you age, you're recording less of your life in memory. You're becoming a spectator rather than a participant in your own existence. Ancient Vedantic concept of turiya, the fourth state of consciousness beyond waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, describes what Nietzsche would later call awakening. It's not mysticism, but a quantifiable shift in brainwave patterns and neurochemistry that fundamentally alters how you perceive reality. When you awaken to the preciousness of your existence, your brain literally operates differently. Most people live their entire lives in borrowed understanding. They absorb values from parents, teachers, media, and culture, then mistake these absorbed values for their own authentic desires. They chase promotions they don't want, maintain relationships that don't nourish them, and postpone dreams indefinitely while waiting for permission that will never come. You were taught the recipe for living before you could even speak. Study hard, secure credentials, find a stable job, accumulate possessions, reproduce, retire, then die. A conveyor belt of existence moving steadily toward the incinerator. No one asked if this was what you wanted. It was presented as the only rational option. The Chandogya Upanishad contains a profound declaration, Tat Tvam Asi, that thou art. This isn't religious sentiment, but a precise description of consciousness recognizing itself. When you perceive the universe not as something separate from you, but as a manifestation of the same consciousness that you are, something remarkable happens in your neurology. The default mode network, the brain circuit responsible for self-referential thinking, temporarily deactivates. The boundaries between self and world dissolve. This is what Nietzsche meant when he wrote about the Apollonian and Dionysian forces, the tension between individuation and reunion with the primal unity of existence. It's what happens when you stop being a character in a story and recognize that you are also the author, the page, and the entire library. Have you ever experienced a moment of perfect clarity? A second where time seemed to stop and you felt fully present? These aren't random neural misfires. They're glimpses of your actual life breaking through the narrative you've been living within. The Rig Veda speaks of Rita, the cosmic order that governs all existence. This isn't supernatural thinking, but an early recognition of what quantum physics now confirms, that underlying the apparent chaos of existence is a profound interconnectedness, a choreography of energy and information that links all things across space and time. Most people will spend their entire lives never recognizing the grand patterns they're participating in. They'll view their choices as isolated events rather than movements in a symphony they're simultaneously composing and performing. They'll never see the recursion, the fractal nature of experience, where every moment contains reflections of every other moment. Your real life begins when you stop mistaking the map for the territory. When you realize that your thoughts about life aren't life itself. You understand that your narrative about who you are is just that, a narrative, not the raw, unfiltered experience of being. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad states, "You are what your deep driving desire is. As your desire is, so is your will. As your will is, so is your deed. As your deed is, so is your destiny." This isn't mystical thinking, but sophisticated psychology that anticipated modern understanding of how intention shapes perception and behavior. What desires are truly yours? Not the wants manufactured by advertising, not the ambitions instilled by social pressure, not the dreams suggested by entertainment, but the authentic longings that emerge from your unique configuration of consciousness? Few people ever ask this question, let alone answer it honestly. Most live by what Nietzsche called herd morality, the unexamined assumption that whatever the majority values must be inherently valuable. They pursue wealth not because it brings them joy, but because others pursue it. They fear solitude not because they dislike their own company, but because solitude is culturally coded as failure. They chase youth not because vitality itself is precious, but because aging has been pathologized. The Sanskrit concept of svadharma, your unique cosmic function, aligns perfectly with Nietzsche's conception of becoming who you are. It's not about finding some pre-existing essence, but about recognizing that authenticity emerges from alignment between your actions and your nature. You cannot become someone else's version of yourself without perpetual inner conflict. Your real life begins when you stop outsourcing the definition of success. When you recognize that the metrics by which others measure achievement might be utterly irrelevant to what would constitute a life well lived by your own standards. The Katha Upanishad contrasts Shreyas, the good, the beneficial, with Preyas, the pleasant, the immediately gratifying. Modern neuroscience confirms this ancient wisdom. Our brains contain competing systems for immediate reward versus long-term fulfillment. The default pathway, the one requiring no conscious intervention, always favors immediate gratification. It takes deliberate metacognition to override this circuitry. How often do you choose the path of least resistance? How frequently do you sacrifice what matters deeply for what feels good momentarily? Honest the scroll instead of the book, show instead of the conversation, purchase instead of the creation, silence instead of the difficult truth. Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence asks you to consider whether your life would be worth reliving infinitely, exactly as it is, with no changes. Would your answer be affirmation or horror? The Vedantic concept of karma approaches the same question from a different angle. Every action creates an impression on consciousness that shapes future possibilities. Both philosophies point to the same revelation. Each moment isn't just a standalone event, but a link in a chain extending backward and forward through time. Your real life begins when you start treating each decision as if you'll experience its consequences eternally, because in a very real sense, you will. Every choice alters your neural architecture. Every experience becomes encoded in your being. You are the sum total of your responses to existence up to this moment. Most people never fully inhabit their lives. They hover slightly above or beside their experience, perpetually commenting on it, judging it, comparing it to others' experiences, wishing it were different. They are everywhere except here, everyone except themselves, everyone except now. The Mandukya Upanishad describes consciousness as having 4 states: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and turiya, pure awareness beyond the other 3. Modern brain research confirms distinct neurological signatures for these states. What's remarkable is that most people spend their entire lives cycling between only the first 3 states, never experiencing the 4th, even though it's available to them at any moment. Your real life begins when you access this 4th state, not as a momentary experience, but as the ground of your being. When you stop identifying exclusively with the contents of consciousness and recognize yourself as consciousness itself. Nietzsche wrote, I tell you, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. The Nasadiya Sukta of the Rig Veda describes creation emerging from non-existence. Darkness was hidden by darkness in the beginning, with no distinguishing sign. All this was water, the life force that was covered with emptiness, that one arose through the power of heat. Both traditions recognize that creativity requires embracing uncertainty, dwelling in the fertile void of possibility before manifestation. How much of your life is spent avoiding uncertainty? How often do you choose the known mediocre over the unknown potential? Your brain is designed to seek predictability. It's a survival mechanism. But what serves survival doesn't necessarily serve living. Your real life begins when you start actively seeking experiences that cannot be predicted or controlled. When you develop a taste for the exhilaration of not knowing what comes next. When you recognize that security is largely an illusion anyway, a comforting narrative we tell ourselves while riding a rock through infinite space at 67,000 miles per hour. The Vedantic concept of neti-neti, not this, not that, is a cognitive technique for discerning reality by process of elimination. Similarly, Nietzsche's philosophy of skepticism advocates questioning every assumption, every value, every certainty. Both approaches recognize that direct apprehension of reality requires first clearing away accumulated misconceptions. Most people never question their fundamental assumptions about reality. They accept the premises they were given and simply follow them to their logical conclusions. They play the game without ever examining the rulebook or questioning whether this is even the game they want to be playing. Your real life begins when you start asking dangerous questions. What if the things I've been taught to value aren't actually valuable? What if the success I've been chasing would feel empty even if achieved? What if my fear of certain experiences has been keeping me from my own fulfillment? What if I've been measuring my life by metrics that have nothing to do with what would actually make it meaningful? The Ashtavakra Gita states, "You are not bound by anything. What does a pure person like you need to renounce?" Putting the complex organism to rest, you can go to your rest. This isn't spiritual bypassing, but sophisticated cognitive science. Your sensation of being trapped, constrained, or limited is primarily produced by thought patterns, not external circumstances. Most people spend their lives trying to rearrange external conditions in the hope that the right configuration will finally produce lasting contentment. They change jobs, partners, cities, appearances, always with the same operating system running underneath. They never address the root cause, the consciousness experiencing these conditions. Your real life begins when you stop trying to solve inner problems with outer solutions. When you recognize that all experience is filtered through your consciousness, and that transforming consciousness itself is the most direct path to changing your experience. Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, love of fate, parallels the Bhagavad Gita's teaching on performing action without attachment to results. Both philosophies recognize that true freedom doesn't come from controlling outcomes, but from bringing total presence and acceptance to whatever is occurring. Most people live in perpetual resistance to what is. They argue with reality, reject present circumstances, and fixate on how things should be different. This isn't just philosophically unsound, it's neurologically devastating. Resistance to what is produces chronic stress, which triggers inflammatory cascades throughout the body and brain. Your real life begins when you stop fighting what is and start working with it. When you recognize that acceptance isn't passive resignation, but the foundation of effective action. You cannot change what you refuse to acknowledge. The Upanishads describe the self as neti, neti, not this, not that, indicating that your essential nature transcends all categories and concepts. Nietzsche similarly rejected fixed identity. The individual is something quite new which creates new things, something absolute. All his acts are entirely his own. Both traditions recognize that authentic selfhood isn't some static essence to be discovered, but a dynamic process of creation. Most people spend their lives trying to become something specific, successful, attractive, respected, without realizing that every act of becoming is simultaneously an act of limiting. The more precisely you define yourself, the more possibilities you exclude. Your real life begins when you embrace the paradox of identity, that you are simultaneously nothing and everything, neither and both, a process rather than a fixed entity. When you stop trying to become and start allowing yourself to be. The ancient Rigvedic hymn to creation asks, "Who really knows? Who in this world can declare it? Whence was it born? Whence came this creation? The gods are later than this world's formation. Who then knows whence it first came into being?" This isn't religious uncertainty, but scientific humility, the recognition that ultimate reality may exceed our cognitive capacities. Nietzsche similarly wrote, "We have art in order not to die of the truth." Both traditions acknowledge that direct confrontation with the raw data of existence, its vastness, its complexity, its indifference to human concerns, can be overwhelming. We need frameworks, metaphors, and narratives to make meaning from the meaningless. Most people adopt ready-made meanings rather than crafting their own. They accept inherited frameworks without questioning whether these structures actually fit their experience. They wear philosophical hand-me-downs and wonder why nothing seems to fit quite right. Your real life begins when you start creating meaning rather than consuming it. When you recognize that significance isn't inherent in events, but emerges from your relationship to them. When you become the artist of your own existence rather than a character in someone else's story. The Vedantic concept of Sat Chit Ananda describes absolute reality as existence consciousness bliss. This isn't mystical poetry, but a precise phenomenological observation that at the root of unfiltered experience lies an intrinsic contentment, a natural state of well-being that doesn't depend on external conditions. Nietzsche's will to power isn't about dominating others, but about constantly overcoming oneself, breaking through self-imposed limitations. What does not kill me makes me stronger points to the same understanding as the Upanishadic declaration, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, that your deepest nature isn't fragile but indestructible. Most people live defensively, build walls around their vulnerabilities, avoid challenges that might expose their weaknesses, and choose comfort over growth. They treat themselves as something fragile that must be protected rather than something resilient that develops through testing. Your real life begins when you start deliberately seeking experiences that challenge your limitations. When you develop a taste for controlled discomfort. When you recognize that elasticity requires stretching. The Katha Upanishad uses the metaphor of a chariot to describe the self. The body is the chariot, the intellect the charioteer, the mind the reins, the senses the horses, and consciousness the rider. This isn't religious doctrine, but sophisticated psychological mapping, a recognition that selfhood is a complex, multi-layered phenomenon requiring integration to function optimally. Most people experience themselves as fragmented. Their thoughts contradict their feelings, their words contradict their actions, their conscious desires contradict their unconscious patterns. They're not charioteers, but passengers in a vehicle with multiple drivers fighting for control. Your real life begins when you start integrating these disparate aspects of selfhood, when you develop the awareness to recognize inner contradictions and the courage to resolve them, when you become a symphony rather than a cacophony. Nietzsche wrote, "Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the Superman, a rope over an abyss." The Upanishads similarly describe humans as occupying a unique position in existence, neither purely instinctual like animals, nor fully realized like enlightened beings. Both traditions recognize that humanity is a transitional state, a process of becoming rather than a fixed category. Most people never fully grasp the implications of this transitional nature. They treat themselves as finished products rather than works in progress. They assume their current limitations are permanent rather than phases in an ongoing evolution. Your real life begins when you embrace your incompleteness. When you recognize that what you are now is neither what you were nor what you will become. When you start actively participating in your own evolution rather than passively experiencing it. The Vedic concept of yajna, sacrifice, isn't about appeasing deities, but about the fundamental principle that creation requires destruction. Something must be given up for something new to emerge. Nietzsche expressed the same understanding in his 3 metamorphoses of the spirit. The camel must become a lion, and the lion must become a child. Each transformation requires the death of the previous identity. Most people cling desperately to what they are, defending identities and beliefs long after they've outlived their usefulness. They would rather remain consistent than become complete. They fear the deaths that precede rebirth. Your real life begins when you start willingly releasing what no longer serves your evolution. When you develop the courage to let parts of yourself die so that new aspects can be born. When you recognize that who you are now is just one of many selves you'll inhabit throughout your existence. The concept of Maya in Vedanta refers to the illusion that keeps us from perceiving ultimate reality. Nietzsche similarly wrote about the veil of Maya that must be pierced to access deeper truth. Both traditions recognize that direct perception requires transcending conceptual frameworks that simultaneously reveal and conceal. Most people never question the lens through which they view reality. Mistake their perception for reality itself, never considering that different frameworks might reveal entirely different truths. They're like fish unaware of water, taking their medium of existence for granted. Your real life begins when you start actively experimenting with different perceptual frameworks. When you develop the cognitive flexibility to shift perspectives at will. When you recognize that no single view captures the totality of what is. The Isha Upanishad states, "Who sees all beings in his own self, and his own self in all beings, loses all fear." Nietzsche wrote that, "When you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you." Both traditions recognize that the apparent boundary between observer and observed is ultimately permeable, that subject and object arise codependently. Most people never experience this dissolution of boundaries. They remain trapped in the subject-object dichotomy, perpetually experiencing themselves as separate from what they observe. They never know the liberation that comes from recognizing separation as a useful fiction rather than an absolute truth. Your real life begins when you experience moments of non-dual awareness, not as philosophical concept, but as lived reality. When you taste, even briefly, what it's like to perceive without the distortion of separation. When you recognize that consciousness itself is not contained within your body, but that your body, and indeed all forms, arise within consciousness. The Mundaka Upanishad uses the metaphor of 2 birds in a tree, one eating the fruit, the other watching. These represent the experiencing self and the witnessing awareness. Modern neuroscience confirms this dual aspect of consciousness we both experience and observe ourselves experiencing. This capacity for meta-awareness, for self-reflection, is uniquely human. Most people identify exclusively with the experiencing bird, never developing their capacity as witness. They're so immersed in the content of consciousness, thoughts, emotions, sensations, that they never recognize the context in which these contents appear. Your real life begins when you strengthen your witnessing capacity, when you develop the ability to observe your experiences without being completely absorbed by them, when you recognize that you are not just the protagonist of your life, but also its audience. We've wandered through ancient wisdom and modern understanding, quantum physics and neuroscience, philosophy and direct experience. And what have we found? That your real life, not the one prescribed by society, not the one limited by fear, not the one defined by others' expectations, begins the moment you recognize that you've been living someone else's version of your story. It begins when you realize that what you thought were walls were merely projections, that what you assumed were limitations were merely habits, that what you accepted as reality was merely consensus. Your real life begins when you stop postponing authenticity for security, when you cease trading fulfillment for approval, when you quit sacrificing presence for planning. It begins when you recognize, as Nietzsche did, that no one can construct for you the bridge upon which precisely you must cross the stream of life, no one but you alone. The Vedas called this swadharma, your unique cosmic function that no one else can fulfill. Most people will live and die without ever beginning their real lives. They'll follow scripts written by others, chase goals they never chose, and measure success by metrics they unconsciously absorbed rather than consciously selected. They'll exist, but they won't live. But you who have stayed with this exploration, you who have felt something resonating beyond the words themselves, you stand at the threshold. You sense that there's more available than what you've been experiencing. You feel the stirring of a deeper authenticity trying to emerge through the cracks in your conditioned existence. Your real life isn't waiting for you in some distant future when circumstances are perfect. It's not contingent on achieving specific goals or acquiring certain possessions. It doesn't require permission, validation, or even preparation. It begins now, in this moment, with a simple recognition that what you've been experiencing up to this point has been, at best, a rehearsal. The real performance, the one that matters, the one that's uniquely yours to give, starts the moment you decide to stop playing a role and start expressing your essence. The question is not whether you're ready. The question is whether you're willing to risk authenticity over approval, willing to choose presence over distraction, willing to write your own script rather than following one handed to you. Your real life begins the moment you decide it does, not tomorrow. Not when conditions improve, not when you feel more confident or certain. Now, here, in this breath, are you ready to begin?